Afternoon all. Okay, so today's poem is Caroline Duffy's War Photographer. Just before I start taking you through the methods and their effects and looking at the contextual links as well that we're going to discuss in this poem, I do just want to mention this poem has already come up, came up on last year's exam, so it's unlikely to be the poem that comes up on this year's paper. That said, it is a very straightforward poem. It's an easy one to get to grips with. It tells a story that I think is quite universally accessible, and it would be a brilliant one to compare to any of the other poems on conflict because it explores conflict from a different perspective. While many of the poems from within the collection explore the nature of conflict from the perspective or indeed through the eyes of soldiers, Duffy's poem chooses to explore the nature of conflict and to look in particular at the effects of conflict on those who are compelled to report it. And this is the standpoint that I would explore for your AO3 big idea. This is her way into discussing broader ideas about the lasting effects of war, the lasting effects of trauma on those who experience it. So that would be my overarching message, that Duffy uses this poem as a vehicle to explore the effects of conflict on those who are compelled to report it, those who feel that drive, that desire, that need to report on the conflict that they bear witness to. As an interesting contextual point, this poem is based on her friendships with war photographers, so much like in the same way that Ted Hughes based Bayonet Charge perhaps on the experiences of his father, or the way in which Simon Armitage used interviews with soldiers who had fought in the Gulf War to inform his writing in Remains, Duffy similarly has drawn on the experiences of others to help inform this particular poem. And we can make interesting contrasts there with another poem about conflict, Wilfred Owen's Exposure, which does explore conflict through the perspective of a soldier, but gains particular resonance and poignancy as a result of the fact that Owen is writing about his own experiences. Okay, so another key point to mention in terms of the broad ideas that this poem is being used to discuss, I think that this poem really gains a lot of its power as it explores that conflict, that tension between two competing desires. The very human desire to directly help those that we see suffering, but also a slightly more complex, perhaps more hard to understand need, the desire to document the suffering of those who are experiencing it. So the role of a war photographer is a particularly difficult one, it's a particularly challenging one, and this poem really explores the psychological suffering of someone who has witnessed great pain, who's witnessed conflict, who's witnessed atrocities around the world, and who now is really coming to terms with how that has affected him. Okay, so a brilliant poem, absolutely one that I would consider getting to know really well so that you could use it to compare to a poem about conflict were you to get one in the exam. Okay, in terms of the structure of this poem, we have four stanzas, each of a regular length, a very straightforward rhyme scheme here, and overall the impression that I think Duffy is trying to create is one of calm and purpose and measure and control. This poem is all about the sort of psychological control that this man has to have over himself in order to do his job. And as I unpick some of the imagery within this poem as well, we will see how he manages to control emotions which otherwise could get the better of him. All right, so line 1 then. In his darkroom, he is finally alone. And this brings with it a sense of isolation, but also in that word finally, that brings a sense of relief, as though this is a longed for moment. He's been through conflict, he's been surrounded by people, and would have had very little privacy or personal space over the course of his last assignment. So in his darkroom, at this point of reflection, he finally has time to himself. The next line is one of the most powerful images within the whole poem, and it speaks to this idea of control. With spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. So the spools of suffering, this use of imagery describes the canisters of film. We could also describe this as metaphorical language. They are not literally spools of suffering. They contain images of those people who are experiencing pain. We might also comment on the use of sibilants here. Now, talking about effects like sibilants and assonance, effects which relate to the sounds that words make, can be a little bit of a challenging thing, and I think you really want to do it very judiciously. Here, I think that this use of sibilants is quite consciously done, and I think it is used to create a hushed, calm, quiet atmosphere. So, creates calm, hushed atmosphere. So, these are the methods, these are the effects. And these spools of suffering, these canisters of film, are set out in ordered rows. And I think, to me, this phrase is a really powerful one because it creates that sense that he has come home, he's unpacked all of his things, and he's very carefully and methodically lined up these canisters of film in neat, tidy, structured, controlled, organised form. And this really creates, I think, a sense of desire on the part of that photographer to enforce control, to put in place a sense of order over events which would have been chaotic, over these conflicts, these wartime experiences that would have been alarming and terrifying and chaotic, where he would have had very little control over what was taking place. So this phrase speaks to a desire to enforce control and bring a sense of order following the chaos of living in war zones. Okay, the only light is red and softly glows. So this is the light that will be shining in the dark room. I think colour symbolism is quite an interesting one within this poem. Knowing that these photos are of people in pain and suffering, that word red immediately brings with it connotations of bloodshed and violence. The only light is red and softly glows, casting all of these images of pain and suffering into that red light. I have to say, if I was picking out a line out of this stanza to annotate, you can see that I've highlighted all of these in green that I think are the most interesting, really. I'm commenting on that because I think it's a nice little detail. If I were to pick out an entire line and annotate it, I really wouldn't go for that one. But as we're building up a picture of this environment and this atmosphere, I think it helps to build that image in our minds. And it glows softly. Softly glows. So just like these spools of suffering set out in ordered rows, the only light is red and softly glows. We have that sibilance just gently recurring throughout that line, and it creates this real sense of peace and calm. And to reinforce that sense of peace and calm, Duffy brings to mind one of the most kind of peaceful images there is. She compares his darkroom to a church. So in this extended simile, Duffy creates a sense of peace, and reverence. This is a respectful moment. As he's looking through these photographs, he's not doing this carelessly. He's not doing this, sort of mechanically. He's taking care. He's taking time. He's ordering things just so in their ordered rows. And this is an almost religious atmosphere. I've mentioned before, talking about this poem, the idea of bearing witness. He has seen these people suffering and he treats it with the utmost seriousness. This is an almost religious ceremony for him. As he's developing these photographs, it creates that real sense of solemnity. Solemnity, like the word solemn, seriousness. As though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. This religious imagery, I think, this religious language is particularly interesting because it brings to mind that idea of inner conflict. Christian teaching argues that we should help our neighbour. Love thy neighbour is one of the most oft repeated phrases that comes from Christian teaching. And it invites us to question this idea of whether the job of a war photographer is a moral one. By taking photographs of these people suffering, are you helping them? Are you benefiting them? Well, directly, no. but indirectly through drawing attention to their plight, through drawing attention to the immorality of war and conflict on a larger scale, there is a moral component to it. But many war photographers who discuss their work talk about this sense of conflict, this difficult decision that they must constantly be making. Do I help this person, or do I bear witness to their suffering? So it's really fascinating, I think, that Duffy in this first stanza compares the photographer to a priest, someone undergoing these religious ceremonies. And these pauses here, we have the use of full stops at the end of these lines, and it really creates that sense of structure and calm and control. Contrast this with Simon Armitage's Remains. Look at the amount of enjambment in that, suggesting the chaotic, overspilling emotions that the persona is undergoing. And then contrast this with the careful use of full stops at the ends of lines, but also the use of caesura throughout this poem. And all of that helps to reinforce this sense of personal psychological control. Okay, so we have this list now. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. And each place name is followed by this caesura. And each of these are, historically, these have been places that have undergone war and suffering. So as he's repeating the names of these lands that he's been to, it almost creates this idea of a litany of suffering. It's as though the priest preparing to intone a mass, is listing the names of these places as though he is praying for those he's seen there. So the use of caesura here and throughout this poem emphasises that need for and that sense of control. And concluding this series of biblical allusions, this repetition of this biblical imagery, Duffy concludes this stanza with a line from the Bible: "All flesh is grass." And this line is used a lot of the time. Historically, it's been used on gravestones and on memorials. And the line particularly speaks to the transitory nature of life, the fact that life is fleeting. And all flesh is grass suggests that process, unglamorous though it is, of decomposition and decay. Ultimately, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, we are all returned to the ground, and life continues without us. So as he's sort of going through these photographs, he's considering the places that he's been and listing these names and creating this sense of prayer. That stanza ends with that allusion to the Bible. Let me add that in. That's our method, it's an allusion. And this creates that sense of a worshipful attitude towards his work, as though he is praying for all those people that he would have seen pass on. And again, between these stanzas, this full stop, emphasising that sense of control. Our second stanza begins with a line that I always read as almost the war photographer speaking to himself and reminding himself he has a job to do. And it creates this sense of profound emotional control. He has a job to do. This isn't the time to become emotional. This isn't the time for too much introspection. He has to treat this professionally. If you look at testimony of war photographers, it's an absolutely fascinating area that I'd really recommend. Do some research, have a look at. There's loads of documentaries and interviews with war photographers available online, and many of them speak about the need for a separation between the work that they do when they're in these war zones and their personal lives when they return home, in many cases returning home to family. And they talk about the need to keep these things mentally and emotionally very separate, to compartmentalise their experiences so that they can continue to do their work, to do it well, but also to return home to some semblance of normality. So he has a job to do. Solutions, and these are the developing solutions that help him to develop the photographs, slop in trays beneath his hands. And this creates that momentary image of carelessness, as though he's doing this hastily. But then we realise that the solutions slop because his hands, which did not tremble then, seem to now. And I think this word tremble is a really powerful one, a really powerful verb, because that verb tremble has connotations of emotional distress, and perhaps even fear. And it reminds us of the effects that these experiences have had upon him. It's been argued by many people that the war photographer within this poem will be suffering from some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, that he will be carrying with him some trauma as a result of his experiences. And if you compare this, again, it remains as the perfect choice of comparison for this poem, because both of them deal with the legacy that war leaves upon those who experience it, the trauma that those that experience or witness war go through themselves. And I think here this verb tremble carries with it that sense that this is a man who has witnessed horrendous suffering and has found it a traumatic experience which has left scars on him. And as he's looking through these photographs, he's reminded of the pain, he's reminded of the conflict, he's reminded of the horror that he's seen. Hands which did not tremble then, though seem to now. This is really lovely, subtle use of juxtaposition. So it contrasts his emotional state when then he was in war, and how his hands only seem to shake now. And there's a million ways of interpreting why this might be. But in my view, the use of this juxtaposition creates that sense that while he was there, while he was in these war zones, he was focused on his work. He was completely driven by the need to bear witness to these events, driven by the need to get the photograph to do the job. And it's only actually now, when he returns home, when he has time for this introspection, when, like a priest, he goes through these photographs and has that almost reverential religious experience, reflecting on the suffering he's seen, it's only now that he really starts to get to grips with what he's been through. So in this line, his hands shaking now creates perhaps the impression that this is when reality begins to sink in. And this is when he really reflects. I think it's quite a nice introspective moment. It's when he's thinking about everything that he's seen. Use of caesura again, creating that sense of control. We have that idea almost of the war photographer, the persona here, starting to realise that his hands are shaking, and again bringing those emotions under control. Rural England. So this is where he lives now, not in a city, in rural England, somewhere peaceful, somewhere calm, somewhere which doesn't experience conflict or suffering on the sort of scale that he would have seen. And again, that use of caesura. Home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel. So this speaks about the simplicity of life in his home country. And ordinary pain creates a really interesting contrast with this line a little further down. Ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, the sort of pain and frustration that ordinary people go through. To fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So here, ordinary pain and explode beneath the feet are used to great effect. The contrast between the suffering he witnessed in these war zones and then the simplicity and the pain of the things that people grumble about when he's at home, which by comparison are utterly trivial. So ordinary pain creates that sense of trivial suffering, the sort of things that aren't really problems on the grander scale. To fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So to emphasise the horror of these exploding fields, Duffy invokes the image of children. And as we've spoken about so many times, whenever we see the word children, we're invited to think of innocence, we're invited to think of vulnerability. And in this particular stanza, Duffy is inviting us to think about a very specific image. This is a direct allusion to one of the most famous war photographs of all time that was taken in the aftermath of a napalm attack during the Vietnam War. If you were to look up that image online, you'd find it very easily. So it's an allusion to a specific famous war photograph. Of children burned by napalm. That photograph is particularly famous because it directly presents utterly unflinchingly the suffering of innocent children. And again, looking at that photo, whenever I've shown it to students in the past, they have always the one question, which is, why did the photographer stop to take the photograph and not do something to help those children? And it's a question that we ask ourselves every time we see an image of profound suffering. And it's a question that war photographers have to make their peace with. The internal conflict between the desire to directly help those that we see in pain, that we directly see suffering, and then the more abstract need to document that suffering in order to try and push for change, in order to advocate for change on a grander, wider scale. Look at this word nightmare heat as well. That creates the impression that this heat, the heat of, in this case of napalm burns perhaps, in a nightmare heat, creates the sense that these events are really beyond ordinary experience. They belong more to the realm of nightmare. As well, when we think about fields of running children in this country, in rural England, we might be invited to think of children playing in the park, playing football, playing with their friends. But when he's previously been in fields and seen running children, it's because they're running away. If you again look at the testimony of war photographers and war reporters, many of them speak about the difficulty of shaking those images out of their minds. If you look at, particularly, there's a film out recently and a documentary about a really fascinating war reporter named Marie Colvin. She speaks about, or she spoke about in her experiences, the difficulty of separating those images of the suffering that she'd seen from the reality, the quotidian, the day-to-day images of children playing. She couldn't look upon ordinary happy children playing without having the suffering of children that she'd seen injured or killed in war brought to mind. Okay, again, always halfway through, I drift, I digress. Let's move on. Okay, the next stanza begins with something is happening. The use of caesura there building a sense of drama, and it invites us to question what is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. Now, there are two interpretations of this at least. One is that this verb twist is used to illustrate the process of the photograph developing. This is a more literal interpretation. So literally, this could imply the photograph developing. But then metaphorically, the stranger's features beginning to twist before his eyes. This word twist evokes pain, as though this stranger's features, this man's eyes, this man's mouth, this man's face is contorted, twisted in an expression of agony. Alternatively, yet another interpretation might be that due to the traumatic events that this photographer has experienced, perhaps his post-traumatic stress disorder may be triggering the beginnings of an almost hallucinatory experience, as though his eyes are playing tricks on him. So faintly start to twist before his eyes. And this beautiful metaphor, a half-formed ghost. And that metaphor, again, on one level, reminds us that the photograph is developing. The ghost is half-formed because the photograph can't yet be seen. This image, this face looks ghostly as it's being brought to life in the developing solution. But again, a half-formed ghost could also perhaps metaphorically reflect the expression of a man caught between life and death. A half-formed ghost. He isn't yet dead, but this photograph has been taken in the moments before he does. He is not yet a ghost. So a half-formed ghost could also, metaphorically, represent an image of a man on the brink of death. An almost ghost, nearly a ghost. Again, a half-formed ghost creates that sense of these kind of shimmering, insubstantial, not quite permanent images that are being developed in the solution. And again, the use of caesura, as the photographer reflects upon this moment, as he thinks back to this moment, and the next two words are he remembers, the caesura functions almost as a pause for breath, as though he is gathering himself, collecting himself, preparing to recall what he's seen. He remembers the cries of this man's wife. So there is physical pain displayed here, perhaps in that verb twist, and later in the line describing the blood staining. But the word cries also speaks to the sense of emotional pain, the suffering of those around him. He remembers the cries of this man's wife and how he, the photographer, sought approval without words to do what someone must. There's two fantastic ideas here, I think. How he sought approval without words creates for me the impression that emotion is a universal language. He isn't able to communicate directly with this woman. He sought approval without words because, well, there's multiple interpretations. Perhaps because he doesn't have the words, he doesn't know how to express, please may I photograph your dying husband. But equally without words, perhaps because he doesn't share a language with this woman. They don't share a common tongue so that he can ask her, so that he can do that courtesy of asking. But he's looking for approval. He's asking for permission, and he asks with his expression, with his face, because holding up a camera and trying to communicate that is the only way that he can. And it creates that impression that this approval takes place without a word being exchanged between either of them. The other line that I think, or the other words that I think are particularly powerful here, and it speaks to this need, this compulsion that these war photographers have to do this job and the conflict that they go through internally, is here. To do what someone must. And this creates the impression that for him this job is a calling, it's a vocation, it's a duty. He feels, I would argue, the moral imperative, the need, the drive to document the atrocities he witnesses. That to turn away from these people would actually be the greater sin, the greater act of cowardice, that not to take the photograph, to put down the camera, would be to flinch in this moment where he has to be brave, he has to be strong. And the consequence, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. This line to me recalls the last lines again of Remains. That imagery of the blood stain echoes Simon Armitage's description of the blood shadow which stayed on the street. And then the foreign dust, again perhaps we might draw a comparison to the sun-stunned, sand-smothered land that he describes at the end of that poem. It's a powerful image, this one. And the line foreign dust, I think, contrasts with the description of rural England back in the second stanza and the idea of ordinary pain. By contrast, this foreign dust seems abstract and almost inexplicable. So the blood staining into foreign dust, the blood stain, the evidence of this pain. But also in those words, foreign dust, dust also evokes, doesn't it, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, perhaps recalling the biblical allusion here, all flesh is grass. Perhaps that's a step too far. Blood-stained into foreign dust then, perhaps creating that sense of remoteness. This is somewhere foreign. And in contrast with Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, here Duffy doesn't tell us exactly where the photographer has been. It's simply somewhere that isn't home, somewhere foreign. And this starts to bring up some of the ideas that were explored in the final stanza, in which really Duffy holds up a mirror to our society and explains to us almost why war photographers are necessary. They are there to help us to understand and to help us to develop empathy for those who are suffering on the other side of the world, in other countries, around the world on a daily basis. And in this final stanza, she confronts us with our indifference. We see so many of these images of pain and suffering that it's very difficult to feel an emotional response to all of them without becoming overwhelmed. And in this final stanza, she explores the internal conflict and the sense of despair, perhaps, that the photographer feels when he realises that while he carries with him the burden of all of the suffering that he's witnessed, the people that look at the photographs that he has taken will flick through them briefly and then move on with their lives. And they have the luxury and the privilege of doing that. So the photographs are described, 100 agonies in black and white. 100 creating this sense of a mass, a multitude. He's taken so many pictures, and these are just the ones that he's given to his editor. 100 agonies, recalling the spools of suffering, these images of pain. Agony suggests intense pain, not your ordinary pain from the stanza 2. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6. So there's the sense that immediately, even before this news has been printed and these photographs have been seen, there's that sense of a reduction in scale, because to look at 100 images of pain and suffering would be overwhelming, would be too much, is more than we can be asked to do. So the editor picks out 5 or 6. And this shift, this juxtaposition between the 100 and the 5 or 6, creates the impression of our limited perspective. Not the photographer's, ours as an audience. And it also creates the sense that the pain, the suffering is being reduced or concealed by this process of selection. We'll pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. Caesura, full stop. And we just reflect on that for a moment. The sense that almost this pain, this suffering has been minimised. At least in our eyes, if not the photographer's. And now we see the reaction. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears. So for a moment, they're not sobbing, they're not bawling, they're not wailing with grief and pain. These aren't cries like those who've really experienced pain. Their eyeballs prick with tears. For a moment, a pang of emotion. So this brief, fleeting sympathy. When we look at these photographs, we feel sad for a moment and then we move on with our lives in a way that the people who live in war zones, the people experiencing war, the people who are living through conflict can't. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and the pre-lunch beers. So here, Duffy uses these images, this imagery, to depict the privileged lives we lead. These are luxuries that she's describing. Between the bath and the pre-lunch beers, having a quick look through the paper, feeling momentary sympathy and then moving on. And now we return to the photographer himself. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively, without emotion. But where he earns his living, and they do not care. And this creates, again, that sense that he has a job to do. And I think this line is a little bit dishonest in a way, to where he earns his living. So this line echoes the idea that he has a job to do. And I say I think this line is somewhat dishonest because it creates that impression that this is just a way of earning a living. It implies that it's just a job. And we know there are 100 ways to earn money. This is something which requires an immense emotional involvement on the part of the participant. And if we need any further evidence of that, Duffy compares him to a priest in the first stanza, as though looking over these photographs is a religious experience with deep spiritual significance. This is not just a job. This is not just the way in which he earns his living. This is something that he is driven and compelled to do. And we know this because he's on the aeroplane again, leaving on another assignment. He's en route to his next war zone. And he's looking out on this country with judgment, where he earns his living, and they, and make no mistake, they is his audience, and this is us. They do not care. So this is the indifference of people to global suffering. When we watch the news and we see atrocities taking place around the world, we feel pity, we feel sympathy, but it doesn't last. Because to experience that and to think about that continually would be overwhelming, would be too traumatic, would be too much really for us to bear. The photographer's job is to bear witness, is to document, is to record and report the suffering of those people around the world in order that we can try and understand it. And this last line carries with it, I believe, a real sense of despair. He goes through this suffering. The people he photographs experience immense suffering, but the reaction that he gets from the people that look at his photographs is one ultimately of indifference. So from his aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living. Let's remember, this is his home. Home again, the place he was eager to return to before. But the way he discusses it in this, or the way Duffy presents it in these final lines, is almost as though he is passing judgment on this country. And the fact that the final stanza leaves our war photographer on an aeroplane creates this impression of someone who is continually moving, who has to make his home in so many places that his real home almost no longer exists. And it again speaks to that sense of massive internal conflict between where he earns his living and they do not care. It creates that impression that he is constantly struggling with the nature of his work. Okay, I hope that that's been useful. Again, I think this would be a really, really powerful poem to discuss, and it's one that you can discuss, I'm sure, very well and very confidently if you were to get given any questions related to the effects of war, the traumatic nature of war, the effects of conflict on those who experience it. All right, I hope that that's been useful. I promise I will try and make the next video a little shorter. They are getting longer and longer every time. But good luck with all of your revision, and please do let me know if there's anything that you want me to focus on next.